Good afternoon, everyone. My name is David Barnard. I'm from South Africa. I'm a consultant working in the philanthropy and the African NGO space. I've worked with various organizations in various executive and governance roles over the years. For the last 10 years, I work as a consultant. And I'm also responsible for 2 online platforms that some of you may be familiar with. The African NGOs platform and the African NGO Fundraising Hub platform. And vehicles to support African NGOs with their fundraising, their data and information needs in this kind of changing and sometimes problematic funding environment. So we've been given six questions to reflect on in preparation for the session. So obviously it's different to the previous panels where people dealt with the questions individually. So I will give you some broad overview, I think more in terms of so to give some context to how I see this changing and shifting funding environment, and then welcome to maybe answer any questions if people really want to go deeper into some of the issues. So our first question will really deal with this changing funding ecosystem for feminist and digital rights work in West Africa, the shifts and what is kind of driving these funding shifts. So I think we all are very familiar and aware of the big funding cuts that started at the beginning of last year with the US government deciding to basically phase out international development aid as we've known it forever a day. That funding cuts was not an isolated case. The US government by far was the biggest bilateral donor of health and human rights work in Africa. So if you take that out of the equation, there has to be, there's been a ripple effect across the continent, not only in terms of the US government funding, but since then we've also seen that many or various other bilateral funders, be it the UK, the Dutch, the Germans, have also started to reduce their bilateral funding, or have started to shift in terms of the areas and the issues that they fund and focus on. So those type of changes obviously have a direct effect on many of the organizations in the room or people across the continent that work in the rights, what I would call the rights, be it social justice or human rights related work, including issues around work in the feminist movement. I think another trend that I think is very relevant from a West Africa perspective is obviously changes and shift in the Sahel, which obviously resulted in either donors leaving or taking less of an interest in that part of the world, or even the governments pushing out funders that were active in those spaces. So already in a fairly complicated and a complex funding environment, you know, those type of political developments and the related closing of civic space, again, adds to the complexity and the challenges from a funding point of view, and also how it impacts many civil society organizations. I think the one thing that I would like to highlight, maybe to just stress the point, is that both during COVID, as well as say early on after the US government funding cuts were announced, I was involved in fairly big continental studies that tried to understand what the impact of these developments were on African civil society organizations. And there are clear parallels between the two. Obviously, it caused significant disruptions. So the necessity to start thinking about alternative sourcing, I think, is now more urgent than ever before. Another question deals with, say, how much of the actual funding reaches grassroots and francophone organizations, and what blocks the pipeline. Now, many of you will be far better familiar, better informed about the practical realities of funding flows in kind of a Francophone or a West African context. But there are international studies or studies done by AWID that clearly indicate that the medium funding or budget for organizations working on feminist issues in West Africa probably is in the vicinity of about $22,000 per annum, which means it's predominantly small organizations. And similarly across sub-Saharan Africa, 47% of all organizations in this space basically have a budget around $30,000. So there's not a lot of money either going to these type of organizations in the first place, or, and this is something that I can't speak to, there's maybe just too many organizations that need to be funded, and the funding pool is not big enough to distribute significant portions of money to these type of organizations. So that's the reality check. There's obviously a whole range of related factors that also impact the flow of funding. There are studies, and I think it is well known today, that funding predominantly goes to Anglophone Africa vis-a-vis Francophone Africa. To what extent, what the underlying reasons are for that being historical, political, etc., that's probably a whole different discussion. So that at least is one issue. You don't see many, maybe calls even in French. It's probably predominantly calls are made, say, in English. You know, the smaller the organizations are, obviously there's a bigger burden that organizations carry in terms of due diligence, compliance, etc. All of these issues ultimately impact on the availability and the flow of money to organizations doing the work that many of you are involved in. Then there's a question about funding models. You know, what are the best fit for feminist data work between flexible core support, participatory grant making, or pooled funding, such as the RFLD initiative called the WAWF fund. Now, I don't think the answer to this question is an either or fine. I think given the diversity of the organizations, the complexity of the work being done, you probably need a combination of those sources, maybe not all to one organization. Different organizations probably are better suited for one or the other of those options. But I think all of those options are relevant to this type of work. I think many of the issues that were discussed earlier today, be it is clampdown on civic space, internet shutdowns, technology facilitated gender-based violence. These are not short-term issues. They are, in many cases, they are systematic, or systemic rather, and therefore don't require, or you can't really deal with them on a short-term project basis. So you do need long-term funding commitments to organizations working on these issues, monitoring it, advocating for solutions, etc. So there you probably need a longer-term funding mechanism to support those type of issues. I think when you look at, say, more sensitive issues that needs a lot of credibility in how you fund it, then probably participatory grant-making practices are better suited for it, because you also then base it on the collective voice and the collective input from a whole range of stakeholders to inform the priorities. And then the last option in terms of what's the last one? Pooled funding. So again, if you have many small organizations that need to be funded, they all have their own administrative and compliance burdens, whatever, then a pooled funding mechanism is probably better suited, because you can do it in a local language, you can reduce the administrative burden, etc. So again, depending on the type of organization, the type of issues, any one of these models are probably relevant and should be considered. I think there's clearly a lot of thinking these days about the pooling of funding, especially in an environment where less funding is available or funders have less at their disposal to give. Then by pooling funding, it probably makes sense in terms of the collective impact. But I think it is important in this day and age around participatory grant making and more a democratic approach to how grant making is done, that when we talk about pooled funding, those same principles need to be applied to those that run or administer pool funding. So that participatory aspect can't be suddenly substituted when we talk about pool funding. I'll try and be short. The fourth question was, how can data itself strengthen the case to funders? And what evidence do funders say they need? I think data I refer to in a civil society context as data as the currency of our work, defined. You need data, or the nature of your work, you generate data as a result of your work. You use that very same data to inform your planning or what comes next. And data then is also the issue that you use in your engagements with funders to make the case for why this is important work and ultimately why they need to keep on supporting you. But I think one of the speakers this morning talked about the essence of data is not only to understand the problem or the issue at hand. The real value in data lies in also your ability to use that data to substantiate or make the case about what needs to be done, be it you or the funder or the policymaker, etc., etc. And I think that is the challenge or the opportunity to people in this room in terms of thinking about the value of their data, the value of their data for their own work, for the sector at large, and the issues they deal with. And at the end of the day, funders are as reliant on that data to inform their own work and ultimately make decisions that hopefully would benefit your work as well. And I know, and I don't want to get into the AI discussion, but I think AI, we all know, is as good as, say, the available data. So the value of authentic data generated by people in this room, which are the real and the primary sources of this data, never underestimate the value of that contribution you make to the field, as well as, say, the wider understanding, because then someone in Timbuktu or wherever in the world can use AI to generate a story about something, but at least you will make a small contribution or a significant contribution to the authenticity and the value of that data. I think I'll just deal with the fifth question and maybe leave the sixth question for the audience in terms of what type of commitment should come from the room. So the fifth question really deals with what do equitable donor-grantee relationships look like in practice beyond the rhetoric of shifting power. Again, I think COVID in many ways was the instigator of it, given what happened to many organizations as a result of COVID. That organizations lost funding because they couldn't deliver, they were restricted in their ability to work, etc., etc. There was a realization, and I think almost international outcry, that the way grant funding is managed, the way grant making is done, needed a significant shift, and part of that is also the underlying power relationships between, say, the grant maker or the funder on one side and the beneficiary or the partner on the other side. So I think in recent years, what we've really seen coming to the fore is almost kind of a set of universal principles. Now, to what extent people apply these principles, that's a different issue. But I think the principles around unrestricted long-term funding, I think is now a well-established principle that many funders, at least in terms of their language, they use it in their language. So that, I think, would be a first key principle. I think that the pressure on funders to fund beyond programmatic work and really invest in organizations, be it it's administrative, their systems, their technology, the well-being of the staff members, etc., etc. So that's, I think, a second principle. A third principle, I think, is about participatory grant making, where I think more funders are now more aware that the setting of priorities and the identifying of priorities can't be, say, something that happens in New York or London or Paris or Geneva. You need to do it with the people that actually are doing the work on the ground.
I will skip the parts that David covered because we do have a little bit of overlap, and what you said really resonated with me, David, but my focus will be a little bit more on private philanthropy, so I think it's actually complementary. I'll speak about trends in philanthropy, about some of the obstacles that organizations face in accessing funding, and some possible solutions and the role that data can play. So, 82% of large-scale giving, which is $10 million and more, is done by the Gates Foundation in 2023. That's one foundation giving 82% of grants $10 million or more. Overall, large-scale private philanthropic giving is increasing. So again, to David's point, while the ODA might be decreasing, private philanthropic aid is actually going up. But again, it's very concentrated in two foundations. Gender funding is growing from 1.1 to 3.4 billion, but again, there are 10 foundations giving most of the money for the entire gender funding section. So 4 shifts that we're seeing both anecdotally in the work that I'm doing, but also from research that is coming out, is the rise of funding collaboratives, which I won't spend too much time on because David spoke about them earlier, but this is groups of funders getting together and giving larger sums of money together than they would on their own, generally. A related trend is fewer, larger relationships. So donor teams are getting smaller, and grantors, funders, are giving larger grants to fewer people. So that really makes maintaining the relationship with your funders extremely important. A third trend we're starting to see is that local giving is starting to gain recognition. So local giving is giving within the continent. Within Africa, for example, it has previously not been measured or not been measured well, but there's a growing recognition that this constitutes actually a large portion of funding for a great number of organizations, and that it needs to be tracked better and studied better because it's growing. And then finally, this notion of proximity participation that David covered as well. Making funding decisions from across the continent have not been working, and so this move towards participatory grant making is another trend that we're seeing. As David mentioned, you all know about your obstacles better than I do, but 4 that I have seen is first just getting into the room. More and more funding opportunities are not even posted publicly. They're not solicited. More and more foundations are doing unsolicited grant making, so they have to find you. So the question becomes, how do you get found in this sea of other organizations that are doing equally amazing work? A second obstacle is especially for smaller organizations, and I have the same statistic as David actually, many are working on an average of $22,000 a year. These bureaucratic hurdles, right? Audited financial statements, formal policies, due diligence, these things that were designed for large organizations are screening out smaller effective organizations who just don't have the capacity or the time because they're busy doing the work in order to these requirements. A third obstacle, and again, this is just 4 of many, is that there are small grants and there are massive grants, but that space in between is difficult to access and has fewer available opportunities. So how do you get from the small grants to the really big grants? Where's that middle ground? And lastly, travailler en français, working in French. The calls for proposals are often delivered in English, and they often have short timelines. So as a Francophone organization, the cost of translation and the effort of translation falls on the organization applying for the grant. So being a Francophone organization can inherently disadvantage you when it comes to accessing certain opportunities. En étant des organisations francophones, il peut être plus difficile de répondre aux opportunités qui sont publiées en anglais. So, This is obvious, I think, to everybody. I don't know that I need to really make the case, but diversification is, is better. Now, that could mean funding from different types. For example, contracts from individual donors, from institutional donors, from governments. But it could also mean many different kinds of grants within a same type of funder. So there are two types of diversification. To the extent to which you can diversify your funding sources, this, again, is obvious. It lessens your risk.
En plus de ces personnes, nous avons les communautés qui sont les femmes, les filles, les jeunes, les personnes en situation de handicap, bref, les minorités. Nous avons des organisations, mais des structures d'appui telles que les universités et puis les cabinets d'expertise auxquels les organisations font souvent recours pour avoir des données fiables pour prouver les subventions qu'ils ont reçues, l'impact de ces subventions sur le terrain. Tout ceci est gouverné par des règles. Quand nous obtenons des financements, ça passe d'abord par des appels à projets, des critères d'éligibilité, la sélection, des rapportages et pour prouver ces investissements, ces subventions reçues, à quoi cela a servi, est-ce qu'il y a eu d'impact de ces financements. Et dans l'écosystème, je vais parler rapidement des 3 générations qu'a connu les fonds féministes, qui va de 1980 à nos jours. Les premiers financements reçus par les organisations en Afrique, des pionniers, va de 1980 à 2000, et ce sont les organisations à l'international qui ont mis ces financements à la disposition des organisations communautaires. De 2000 à 2015, nous avons l'émergence des fonds africains, c'est-à-dire des fonds désormais panafricains. Des mécanismes ont été mis en place pour que des organisations en Afrique puissent eux-mêmes trouver les financements. Nous avons par exemple le fonds UAF Africa qui est mis à la disposition des organisations. Je pense plus de 6000 organisations ont été financées. Et nous avons de 2015 à nos jours des fonds régionaux et francophones. Je peux donner à titre d'exemple le fonds WAF du réseau des femmes leaders pour le développement qui depuis 2025 est mis à la disposition des organisations de 9 pays de l'espace francophone. Nous avons le financement flexible et comme je l'ai dit en donnant l'exemple de UAF Africa, les mécanismes participatifs comme le fonds WAF de RFLD et les financements pluriannuels. De ces 4 modèles, on ne peut pas dire voilà, je veux tel ou tel, mais je pense que tous ces financements sont complémentaires. Si toutes les organisations peuvent obtenir ces financements, ce serait bien. À défaut d'obtenir ces financements, 2 financements sont indispensables. Ce sont les financements institutionnels et pluriannuels pour permettre aux organisations de mener des activités pérennes sur plusieurs années. En parlant des données, comment les données renforcent-elles l'argumentaire auprès des bailleurs? Ces données ne sont que des preuves de confiance quand nous mettons ces données à la disposition des bailleurs après l'octroi des subventions. Nous mettons souvent en tant qu'organisation bénéficiaire des données quantitatives, qualitatives et autres. Ensuite, j'aimerais aborder la co-construction de projets en matière de renforcement de relations équitables. C'est-à-dire, avant même l'octroi de la subvention, le projet pour lequel la subvention sera accordée est co-construit par les 2 parties.
Moi, j'aimerais savoir quelles sont les recommandations que vous pourriez donner aux organisations francophones pour mieux répondre aux exigences des bailleurs. Car aujourd'hui, nous voyons que c'est des parties. On ne sait pas demain qui d'autres comme bailleur partira également. Et comme constat, pourquoi ces derniers temps, le bailleur finance beaucoup plus des réseaux plutôt que des organisations individuelles?
I'll deal with the questions from over there first. So I hope I've got it. So the first question was, if I understand it, why more funding for networks than organizations? And I think that was preceded by just funding for francophone organizations vis-a-vis anglophone, or why, what should francophone organizations do better or do more of? So I think the question about networks vis-a-vis organizations, if that in fact is a fact, so I can't speak to the fact that, is that in fact, so now I'm talking about a lot of facts, but is that the reality that that funding predominantly goes to networks vis-a-vis individual organizations? So I'm just going to work on the basis that that is in fact correct. My logic would tell me that if less funding is available, it's probably on one level a safer option, but probably funders would argue maybe more bang for their buck by supporting a network that already represents many organizations with, say, like-minded interests that work on common issues. So by supporting the network, you directly and indirectly get the most out of your funding, and the funding would would have maybe more impact than working with individual organizations. So I'm answering that question a little bit, in the dark, because I'm not familiar with the fact that there is a trend towards supporting more networks than individual organizations. So just take my response in context. It's probably more a philosophical or theoretical response than something based on fact. The question about francophone organizations vis-a-vis anglophone organizations, or what should francophone organizations do more or do better of? Again, I think it's a tricky question. I think we talked about the language issue maybe more often than not, that proposals or requests for proposals are published in English, so by implication there's more pressure or more stress on a francophone organization to respond to it, because maybe it's not a natural response. It's maybe not where you look for opportunities or where you look for information about opportunities. So that could be one thing. It might be that funders have if you think about private philanthropy and big private philanthropy organizations like the foundations that Erin mentioned, Gates, Rockefeller, Ford, whatever, they probably have a leaning towards Anglophone Africa, be it historical for whatever reason. So maybe there's a natural tendency for more money to flow to that part of the world. In the same vein, Francophone Africa, West Africa probably have a certain relationship with, say, France and other French-speaking countries. So probably that should be maybe more of a starting point for looking for international opportunities. Again, maybe that is a field that is changing. It's a world that is changing, and it's probably no longer simple lines like, say, historically. So again, if Francophone Africa and Francophone African organizations are getting less support, then probably there's a bigger onus on the organizations in understanding their funding environment, having, say, someone or the organization at large tracking funders, tracking funding opportunities, and be ready and prepared to respond to those opportunities, in line with your own priorities. And that is not unique to Francophone organizations. I think in this current funding environment, there is just more pressure on a civil society or a non-profit organization to be more proactive in how you track and respond to, say, funding opportunities on the one side. But I think also something that Erin referred to, I think, and I alluded to it as well, it is critical that organizations start thinking beyond grant funding as a way of sustaining them in the future. That is easier said than done. But if the funding world doesn't improve, then you'll have to start thinking about alternative means of funding. There's the diaspora funding, there's crowdfunding, there's social enterprise models. And I think in this day and age, you need to familiarize yourself with these alternative models and see if one or any of them are relevant to your organizational work.